She pushed a cart through the pediatric wing at 2,247 hours, refilling for drips with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were always waiting to fail, and the antiseptic smell, that particular hospital smell that never quite faded, mixed with the floor wax someone had applied too liberally near the supply closet. Sarah Chen moved without sound. Her name tag read Chen, RN in small white letters, the font deliberate and forgettable. Nobody looked at her twice. That was the point. The slight limp in her left leg came from a major alleyway 3 years ago, a ricochet that didn't quite end her, and she favored that side just enough to seem vulnerable without actually being wounded. The hospital staff had stopped asking about it by week 2. Nurses with old injuries were common. Unremarkable. Safe. In room for 12, 9-year-old Emma Carstairs lay half asleep, her head tilted against the metal rail. Sarah approached with the 4-bag held level, her movements economical, controlled. The girl's hair loss was visible even in the dim light, patches of scalp showing where hair had simply stopped growing. Patchy. Irregular. Wrong. Emma had been losing it in clumps for 6 months, and 15 different specialists had all shrugged and prescribed nothing that helped. "Hi, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, checking the line. The 4 was clean. The needle placement was perfect. She had done this 200 times since arriving at St. Michael's 3 weeks ago, but each time she looked at Emma's scalp, something shifted in her chest. She had learned to keep that shift internal. "How are you feeling?" "My head itches," Emma said, her voice small. The girl was clutching something in her right fist, a tarnished military challenge coin, brass oxidized green and black from age. Sarah had seen it before. Emma held it during the anxiety spikes, when the fear of going bald spiked harder than the fear of the treatments. The girl never explained where it came from. Her father had given it to her. Admiral James Carstairs, currently deployed, had pressed it into Emma's small hand before shipping out 6 months ago. Right before the hair loss started. Sarah made a mental note. Not in the official chart. In the one she kept locked in the locker downstairs, the one that existed for reasons St. Michael's would never understand. "The itching means you're healing," Sarah said, and it wasn't technically a lie. The girl's scalp asterisk was asterisk responding to something, just not to any of the 15 treatments 15 doctors had prescribed. "Your body's working hard. Let me know if it gets worse tonight, okay?" Emma nodded, her small fingers tightening around the coin. Sarah adjusted the pillow, pressed the back of her hand against the girl's forehead out of habit, cool, normal temp, and moved on. 3 doors down, she stopped at room for 18. Sergeant David Torres was sleeping, his massive frame taking up the whole bed, his left arm thrown across his chest in a way that suggested even sleep couldn't ease him. The name Chen was tattooed on his left forearm in thick military lettering, the ink faded to a blue-gray that looked like storm clouds. She had carried him 3 miles through Marja with a sucking chest wound 5 years ago. She had kept his airway open with her hands and her voice. She had told him to stay alive because there were people waiting for him, and she had meant every word. The morphine had stolen a lot of things from his memory. It had stolen her face. Sarah checked his vitals without waking him. Heart rate steady at 68. O2 sat at 98%. The dressing on his shoulder was clean. She had changed it herself for hours ago, her hands moving with a kind of precision that came from having held a man together while a medevac bird tried to land on a windy ridge. She didn't sign the chart with her initials. She let her signature look like the other nurses. The handwriting was close enough if you didn't look too hard. She didn't ever look at his face for more than 2 seconds. It was safer that way. The chart for Emma was bothering her more with each shift. She had photocopied the specialist reports: dermatologist, rheumatologist, endocrinologist, allergist, immunologist, and every single one of them said the same thing: etiology unclear. Recommend supportive care. 15 doctors, and none of them had asked the one question that mattered: where was the girl's head when the loss started? What had changed 6 months ago that could cause this pattern? Sarah finished her rounds at 2,310 hours and was heading back to the nurse's station when she heard the announcement over the intercom, the static crackle followed by a voice that made every nurse in a 6-bed radius look up from their screens. Staff meeting. Conference room. Day shift and night shift. Mandatory. 15 minutes. It wasn't a request. Dr. Whitfield was already in the conference room when they filed in, his tailored blazer thrown over a chair, his expensive watch visible because he kept checking it like he was counting down to something amusing. He had that kind of smile, the kind that didn't involve his eyes, just the corners of his mouth and a slight lift of his chin that suggested he already knew the joke before he told it. He was 42, old money from somewhere back east based on the way he pronounced certain words, and he had been running the pediatric department for 7 years with the kind of authority that came from funding sources nobody questioned. Sarah took a seat at the back of the room, her hands folded in her lap, her face the kind of neutral that made people forget you were there. She had mastered this particular version of invisibility a long time ago. It was one of her best skills. "Good evening," Whitfield said, and the room quieted immediately. "I wanted to talk to you all about staffing trends. We've had some new hires lately, and I've noticed something interesting about the night shift nurses. High turnover. People quit." He smiled that smile again. "Nursing is demanding work. Not everyone has the stomach for it. Some people come in with big ideas about saving lives, and by week 3, they realize they don't have what it takes." He was looking directly at Sarah now, his eyes tracking from her shoes to her face with the kind of deliberate slowness that was meant to make someone uncomfortable. Sarah's jaw remained perfectly still. Her breathing remained perfectly even. "In fact," Whitfield continued, leaning against the edge of the desk, "I'll make a wager. With our newest night shift nurse." He turned his full attention to her now, his smile widening. "I'll bet you 1 month's salary that you quit within 7 days. What do you say, Ms. Chen? Think you've got the stomach?" The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that constant electrical buzz that most people never noticed because it was always there, background noise to the machinery of hospitals. But Sarah noticed it now, the way the hum seemed to get louder in the silence, the way nobody moved, the way everyone was waiting to see what she would do. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Awkward, uncomfortable laughter from people who weren't sure if this was a joke or a threat or both. Sarah looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, and her eyes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't show a single thing that was happening inside her chest. "I'm not a quitter, sir," she said, her voice low and steady. 8 words. Clean. Simple. Final. Whitfield's smile never wavered. If anything, it widened. "We'll see," he said. 7 days. I'm looking forward to seeing if you prove me right." Sarah stood and walked back to her assignment, her movements controlled, her limp exactly as pronounced as it had been before the meeting. She could feel people watching her. Wondering. Placing mental bets about whether this new nurse with the unremarkable face and the military-cut hair would actually last a week. What they didn't know was that she had carried a man through Marja with a chest wound that should have killed him in minutes. What they didn't know was that she had earned 3 Navy Commendation Medals before she was old enough to legally drink. What they didn't know was that Dr. Whitfield had just made a mistake. He had looked at the wrong nurse and seen a quitter, when what he was actually looking at was something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose and a child who needed saving. The cafeteria at St. Michael's during lunch rush was a collision of noise, the hiss of steam from the kitchen line, the clatter of trays, the overlapping conversations of 200 hospital workers compressed into a space meant for 150. Sarah Chen sat at a corner table with her back to the wall, a habit that didn't require thinking anymore, eating a salad she wasn't tasting while scanning the room with the kind of systematic attention most people reserved for airports or hostile checkpoints. Her badge read RN and her scrubs were the same shade of faded blue as everyone else's, but her peripheral vision catalogued exits, traffic patterns, and the precise location of every staff member who'd witnessed Whitfield's conference room performance 3 days earlier. The 7-day bet still hung over the unit like humidity before a storm. She'd been at St. Michael's for 3 weeks now, long enough to establish the nurse persona, competent but unremarkable, quiet in rounds, deferential to attending physicians, the kind of mid-shift presence that eventually becomes invisible. The cover had held through Naval Intelligence's careful construction, false credentials from a nursing program in Sacramento, a spotless employment history with a defunct hospital system, a social security number that would withstand a moderate background check. Everything designed so she could spend 18 hours a day close to 9-year-old Emma Carstairs without raising questions. Everything designed so she could watch a child die if the right people wanted her to. Sarah stabbed her fork into the salad again, paying attention now only to the texture, crisp romaine, soft tomato, because sensory focus was easier than thinking about what she'd observed in Emma's room at 3 in the morning. The girl's hair loss wasn't random. It followed a pattern. Specific. Deliberate. Terrifying. 15 different doctors had examined Emma Carstairs. 15 different specialists had run tests, prescribed treatments, written reports that all converged on the same diagnosis: stress-induced alopecia, possibly psychosomatic, possibly environmental. The Admiral's daughter would be fine, they'd said. She needed time. Maybe therapy. Maybe a dermatologist follow-up in 6 weeks. Nothing urgent. Nothing that required extended hospital stays or expensive interventions. Nothing that would justify the kind of billing Whitfield could attach to her case. Sarah was raising the fork to her mouth when the world tilted. Whitfield approached from her left. She'd clocked him entering the cafeteria 45 seconds ago, tracking his trajectory through the crowd, and didn't slow down as he passed her table. He just swung his arm outward with the casual grace of someone flicking lint off his sleeve. The tray left her hands. Pasta and juice and the ceramic plate scattered across the tile floor in a sound like breaking teeth. The salad bowl followed, spinning once before landing upside down. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. 50 heads turned. Whitfield kept walking. Sarah's jaw clenched. Not a tremor. Not a flinch. Just the small muscular contraction of someone processing information at velocity. Her hands remained steady as she set down her fork, pushed back her chair with controlled pressure, and crouched beside the wreckage. Fork. Spoon. Knife scattered across tile that smelled of industrial cleaner and something acidic from the juice pool. She began collecting the silverware with mechanical precision, each piece a small metal sound. Whitfield was talking to a resident 3 tables away, his voice carrying the particular resonance of performance. Some people just don't have the constitution for this work, he was saying. It's not a failing. Not everyone can manage the pressure. The clatter of silverware. The sound of Sarah's breathing, controlled and even. Nothing else. She gathered the broken ceramic, the scattered salad, the napkin soaked with juice. 3 minutes, though it felt longer. 3 minutes of every pair of eyes in the cafeteria watching a nurse clean up her own disaster on her knees. Whitfield didn't look back. He was the kind of predator that didn't need to confirm the kill. Sarah stood, balanced the debris in her hands, and carried it to the trash. Her scrub smelled like Italian dressing and stainless steel. Her knuckles bore the small white marks from gripping the ceramic pieces too tightly, but her face showed nothing. No heat in her cheeks. No moisture in her eyes. No tremor in her voice when she passed a resident who offered, awkwardly, "I could help you." Already handled. Back to the unit. Back to charting. Back to the afternoon rounds where everything happened in front of witnesses again. Whitfield was waiting in Emma's room at 1,400 hours. He stood at the foot of the child's bed, reviewing her chart with the posture of a man who'd never considered that anyone might question his methods. Sarah entered with the medication tray, began setting up the 4 line, and didn't make eye contact. Emma was sleeping, her breathing shallow, the left side of her head already showing the pale scalp where hair had begun falling out in alarming patches. "You have a question about Dr. Morrison's treatment plan," Whitfield said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly reviewed her charting notes. She'd documented everything, the timeline, the pattern, the observations that no attending physician wants from a floor nurse. "Would you like to share?" Sarah felt the room contract. 2 residents were present, both looking at their shoes. An attending physician from infectious disease hovered by the window, equally invested in disappearing. Whitfield dropped Emma's chart. Not through. Dropped. The file struck the tile floor and scattered, papers sliding across the room like confetti, clinical notes and lab results spreading in a loose pattern that would take minutes to reorganize. He did it with a surgeon's precision, ensuring maximum dispersal. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, and his voice held the particular texture of a man enjoying his power. "And then explain to Dr. Hartley here why you're practicing medicine without a license." Sarah looked at him. Not an angry look. Not a frightened look. Just the level stare of someone taking a photograph for later. Then she crouched and began gathering papers. 5 minutes of the residents and physicians pretending to be busy while a nurse retrieved scattered files from under equipment and furniture. 5 minutes of Whitfield watching her work with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just broken something. Sarah's hands didn't shake. Her voice, when she began explaining her observations about Emma's hair loss patterns and the correlation with specific temporal markers, remained steady and clinical. She cited no personal opinions. She made no accusations. She simply presented the data, what she'd observed, when she'd observed it, the pattern that emerged when you mapped the loss against the girl's contact points with surfaces and objects. She spoke like a physician reviewing research. Like someone who'd done this before. Like someone for whom this was muscle memory rather than deviation. Dr. Hartley's face changed halfway through. The resident stopped pretending to review screens. Whitfield's jaw tightened, but he turned and left the room without another word, because Sarah had just accomplished something he hadn't anticipated. She'd made the observations sound reasonable. The afternoon shifted after that. Tension hummed through the unit like current through a live wire. Whitfield moved through the hospital with predatory efficiency, though Sarah noticed he didn't directly confront her again. He was thinking. Planning. Escalating. At 1900 hours, Sarah was restocking the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a narrow space that smelled of cardboard and disinfectant, fluorescent lights casting everything in clinical white. She was alone for the first time since the cafeteria. Alone for the first time since the chart had hit the floor. Alone for the first time since she'd heard Whitfield's voice say sweetheart the way predators use diminutives to establish dominance. She gripped the edge of the sink. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pure, crystalline restraint held in her hands like something that could shatter if she applied pressure wrong. Her knuckles went white against the stainless steel. Her breathing was deliberate, 4 counts in, hold for 4 counts out, the kind of breathing they'd taught her in the Navy to manage the space between action and consequence. She'd been trained to handle hostile takeovers of buildings. She'd carried a teammate 3 miles through Marja with a sucking chest wound while maintaining operational security. She'd cleared rooms with hand signals and practiced humility until it became language. And she was gripping a sink in a supply closet because a man in an expensive suit had called her sweetheart while throwing paper at her feet. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. But what wasn't absurd was what she'd seen in Emma's room. What wasn't absurd was the precision of that hair loss pattern, matching exactly where the girl's head rested against Admiral Carstairs' uniform jackets. What wasn't absurd was the tarnished challenge coin Emma clutched during every anxiety attack, that small piece of naval tradition that might be slowly poisoning a 9-year-old girl with heavy metals that no general practitioner would think to test for because the symptoms looked like stress. Sarah released the sink. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink and saw the face that had been carefully constructed for this assignment, unremarkable, tired, competent, forgettable. The face that belonged to a nurse who'd quit within 7 days. The face of someone Whitfield believed he'd already broken. What he didn't see in that reflection was the Master Chief. What he didn't see was 18 years of Navy service. What he didn't see was a woman who'd survived being buried in rubble and extracted by a Marine named Torres with Chen tattooed on his left forearm in letters she'd never see again. What he didn't see was the threshold she'd already crossed somewhere between the cafeteria floor and this supply closet, the moment when following protocol became impossible and staying hidden became a choice rather than a mission parameter. She had 4 more days before the 7-day bet ended. For more days before Whitfield would expect her to submit her resignation. For more days before the narrative he'd written for her became irreversible. For days for her to find the proof of what was poisoning Emma Carstairs before it became too late to help her. For days before everything changed. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah knew exactly what was coming if she kept pushing, and she was going to push anyway. Because some cover identities were worth maintaining, and some 9-year-old girls were worth losing everything for. But that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part was that she had absolutely no idea that the cascade she was about to trigger would bring a Navy admiral to the hospital's front door with his daughter's life in the balance, and the truth would come out not through protocol or procedure, but through a discovery that Whitfield himself had made impossible to hide. On her 19th night shift, Sarah noticed what 15 doctors had missed. Emma Carstairs lay curled on her side in the darkened pediatric room, one small hand gripping the tarnished challenge coin she'd carried everywhere since her father deployed. Her hair spilled across the white pillowcase in the weak glow of the monitor, and Sarah stood motionless in the doorway, watching the pattern of loss with the same precision she'd once used to read terrain from a reconnaissance helicopter. The bald patches weren't random. They formed a deliberate map where the girl's head rested night after night, the left temple where she pressed against the pillow, the occipital region where the back of her skull made contact, the area behind her right ear worn smooth by repetitive pressure. Not alopecia areata. Not stress-induced hair loss. Not autoimmune. The distribution was too uniform, too specific, too physical. Sarah had been trained to read patterns that others couldn't see. Explosive residue on a suspect's left hand. The angle of a bullet trajectory. The exact pressure point where a carotid artery could be found in absolute darkness. This was no different. This was data written in hair follicles and loss. She pulled on fresh gloves and moved to the bedside with the practiced silence of someone who'd conducted operations in rooms where a single footfall could mean the difference between recovery and catastrophe. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, sinus tachycardia at 98 beats per minute, elevated but not critical. Emma didn't wake. The girl's breathing stayed shallow and even, the respiration of a child medicating her own anxiety through sleep. Sarah's eyes moved to the coin. The challenge coin lay on Emma's open palm, worn silver dull to the color of old gunmetal. She'd seen hundreds of these in her years, military tradition, ceremonial objects passed between service members as a mark of respect or camaraderie. You carried it. You challenged others to produce theirs. If you couldn't, you bought the round. If you could, you won the bet. It was ritual. It was belonging. It was the kind of thing a 9-year-old would clutch like salvation if her father was 3,000 miles away in the Indian Ocean, deployed with a carrier strike group, unable to call, unable to explain why he'd missed her birthday or the school recital or the night she'd first woken up and found a handful of her own hair on the pillowcase. Sarah lifted the coin gently, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. The metal was warm from Emma's palm. She brought it closer to the light from the monitor and examined it with methodical precision, the eagle embossed on one side, the anchor on the reverse, the department seal barely visible beneath years of handling. The tarnish was uneven. Heavy corrosion on the edges. Discoloration in scattered spots across both surfaces, the kind of oxidation pattern you'd see from repeated exposure to. Her jaw went absolutely still. Not tarnish. Not simple corrosion from age. The metallic deposits were concentrated in the creases where the coin would be held. The recesses where sweat and oils would accumulate. The areas of highest contact. And beneath the discoloration lay something else, a faint crystalline residue in the grooves, barely visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Sarah's hands remained steady. Her breathing didn't shift. Her heart rate didn't climb. The composure held because it had been forged in rooms where panic killed faster than bullets, where the smallest tremor would cost lives, where showing fear was a luxury that got your team slaughtered. She was looking at heavy metal poisoning in physical form. Not from the coin itself, the silver was stable. But from whatever had contaminated it. Naval hydraulic systems used phosphate compounds with trace amounts of cadmium and lead. Equipment decontamination in carrier operations wasn't always flawless. Uniforms worn on a flight deck came into contact with dozens of hazardous materials every shift. Admiral James Carstairs had given this coin to his daughter before the last deployment. He'd held it against his uniform, his flight suit, his dress whites. All of them, every single fabric, carrying the invisible residue of his workplace like a disease he'd unknowingly delivered to the one person in the world he was trying to protect. Sarah photographed the coin with her secure phone, the flash disabled, using the light from the monitor to capture 3 angles. She photographed the pattern of Emma's hair loss on the pillow. She opened a new secure text thread and typed 4 words, "Heavy metal contamination confirmed." The response came in 90 seconds, awaiting verification. Do not act. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that at 1,400 hours the next afternoon, Sarah was called to Dr. Whitfield's office, where he sat behind his desk with his fingers steepled like a man who'd just won something important, and he smiled at her with the thin satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered prey in a box canyon. "Master Chief," he said, using her rank for the first time, and Sarah's entire nervous system registered the threat. No one called her that. No one was supposed to know. Your particular skill set seems better suited to other departments. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to the psychiatric wing. Night shift, same hours, same pay, but you'll be more valuable working with our mental health patients. Your nursing supervisor has been notified. Sarah didn't move. Didn't blink. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. "Is there a problem?" Whitfield asked, and there was something in his voice that told her he'd already made moves she couldn't yet see. His desk had a closed memo folder positioned at 45 degrees. His left hand was steady. His right hand rested on his phone. He was comfortable. He'd already done what he came to do. "No problem, Doctor," Sarah said, and her voice came out exactly as it should, deferential, compliant, a nurse accepting an assignment. "I can transition tonight." "Excellent." He slid a printed reassignment across his desk. His signature was already dry. "Patient care optimization." "You understand." She understood perfectly. Pediatrics was being closed to her. Emma Carstairs was being closed to her. Whatever Whitfield had discovered, and it was clear now that he'd discovered something, he was removing the one person in the hospital who might actually solve the case and interfere with whatever arrangement he had in motion. That evening, Sarah approached the pediatric wing's medication room at 1947 hours and swiped her badge. The light flashed red instead of green. Access denied. She tried again. Same result. Her secure phone buzzed 3 minutes later with a message from her handler: "Badge restrictions implemented, BY administration 81,600 hours. Whitfield initiated request. Maintain cover." She stood in front of the locked door and watched through the glass as a new nurse struggled with Emma's for line, a young woman, maybe 2 years into her career, rotating the butterfly needle with uncertainty while Emma whimpered and pulled away. The girl's forearm was already beginning to bruise. 3 attempts. 4. Sarah's hands curled into fists at her sides, and the trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. The trembling was the sound of all the rules she'd agreed to follow cracking under pressure that had only one possible outcome. At 1945 hours, Sarah found Dr. Morrison in the physician's lounge, a pediatrician with 15 years of experience and a reputation for listening to evidence. She pulled him aside and presented her findings: the coin, the hair loss pattern, the toxic metal compound, the contamination vectors from naval hydraulic systems. Morrison frowned and nodded and then produced a memo from his jacket pocket. "Whitfield already consulted on this case this afternoon," he said quietly. "He reviewed everything with toxicology. Cost-benefit analysis suggests observation protocol, not intervention." The memo was dated that same day. Typed cleanly. Signature dry. Prepared in advance. Whitfield had built his defense before Sarah had even moved. He'd anticipated her findings. He'd preempted her evidence. He'd constructed a paper wall between her and the patient using the hospital's own bureaucracy as a weapon. At 2,100 hours, Sarah's secure phone vibrated in her pocket. Maintain cover. Handler aware of identity inquiry. Do not escalate. At 2,230 hours, standing alone in the parking lot of St. Michael's Hospital with rain hammering the asphalt like accusations, Sarah read those words again and made a choice that would end her cover forever. She deleted the message. She turned back toward the hospital doors. She walked toward the psychiatric wing, where she would spend the night shift exactly where Whitfield had placed her, separated from Emma by 3 floors and a locked door and all the rules of engagement that said sometimes you have to let someone else's child die to maintain your position. Except Sarah Chen had spent 12 years carrying people through fire zones. She'd left 3 friends in the dirt of Marja. She'd held a 14-year-old girl's hand while plasma was running cold in her veins. She'd learned that rules were useful until they weren't, and then they were just excuses. And Emma Carstairs was 3 floors away, sleeping on contaminated pillows, unaware that her father's love was poisoning her. She wasn't going to watch. At 02 for 7 hours, Sarah's phone vibrated against her hip. The ICU resident she'd positioned as an early warning system had set up the alert exactly the way she'd instructed. Patient Emma Carstairs, acute drop in creatinine clearance, urinalysis showing metal metabolites spiking past safe thresholds. Her kidneys were failing. The toxic metal that had pooled in her bloodstream, absorbed day after day from a father's love made dangerous, had finally overwhelmed the 11-year-old girl's system. Acute renal failure. Her electrolytes were crashing. Sarah read the lab values once and moved. She abandoned her rounds on the psychiatric wing without announcement. The fluorescent ceiling lights blurred overhead as she took the stairwell 3 steps at a time, her limp forgotten, muscle memory overriding the careful nurse act she'd maintained for 19 shifts. Down! 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 Her scrubs whispered against themselves. The ICU doors recognized her badge before her brain caught up to what she was doing. Blown. Cover blown. But Emma Carstairs couldn't wait for extraction protocols. The first-year ICU resident, a boy named Patterson who couldn't have been more than 26, was spiraling. Emma lay on the bed with lines running into both arms, her small face pale as drywall, her breathing shallow. Patterson's hands trembled as he reviewed her creatinine levels, his voice climbing, BP's dropping. O2 sat is 91, and her potassium is 6.8. That's cardiotoxic, that's going to cause arrhythmia, and the attending isn't here yet and I don't know what to. Sarah's voice cut through his panic like a blade. Chelation protocol. Now. I'll walk you through it. Patterson turned to her, confused. That's not standard ICU. 14-gauge angiocath, 2nd attempt. Her hands were already moving, muscle memory from field medicine that had nothing to do with nursing school. This was Marja. This was a drainage ditch. This was her hand steady while everything around her burned. She found Emma's vein cleanly, thread of steel, 1 insertion. EDTA at 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. Dose it now. But chelation's for heavy metal poisoning and we haven't confirmed. Confirmed. She was already calculating the dosages in her head, numbers aligning with the precision of someone who had studied toxicology as part of her intelligence briefing. Naval hydraulic compounds. Cadmium. Lead particulate. The math was clean. Get me the infusion pump and 100 milliliters of normal saline. Now, Patterson. This girl's heart is seconds from knowing about it. He moved. The young resident followed the voice that had none of the softness of Sarah's earlier shifts, a voice that sounded like command, sounded like someone used to being obeyed during the worst moments. At 0312 hours, the first chelation drip began flowing into Emma's line, the clear liquid carrying molecules that would bind to the toxic metal in her bloodstream and drag it toward her kidneys for elimination. Sarah didn't leave her bedside. She watched the monitors. Heart rate 118. Respiratory rate 22. BP stabilizing. Her presence was a stone. How did you know? Patterson whispered at 0345 hours. Medical intuition. Not a lie. Just redacted. She adjusted Emma's sedation with the economy of someone who had done this under fire, with limited equipment, with the weight of a Marine's life balanced on the precision of her hands. 3 Navy Commendation Medals. Not because she was exceptional. Because she had been forced to be exceptional, again and again, in places where average got you killed. By 0 for 45 hours, the labs came back. Creatinine falling. Potassium normalizing. The metallic load in Emma's bloodstream dropping like an angled descent. The first time in 6 months that her numbers moved toward living instead of toward goodbye. Sarah stepped back from the bedside at 0500 hours, her shift technically over, and she didn't leave. She stood by the monitors and watched the numbers climb. 02 sat 94. Heart rate 108. The curve of recovery invisible to anyone who hadn't been trained to see it. The next voice she heard was Dr. Whitfield's. At 0630 hours, he arrived at St. Michael's with his expensive shoes and his $8,000 suit, the kind that promised he belonged in rooms that mattered. He went directly to the ICU desk, pulled Emma's overnight report, and his face went carefully blank, the expression of a man whose golfing game had just been interrupted by catastrophe. His jaw clenched. He read the chelation notation twice. Then he read Sarah's name on the order. He moved to the quiet hallway and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, each one shorter than the last. The first was to his board president contact, his voice sliding into the easy camaraderie of men with shared investments. We have a problem at St. Michael's. One of your staff violated scope of practice, administered an authorized chelation protocol, and endangered a pediatric patient. We need a formal investigation to document it properly before she does it again. The second call went to the hospital's chief of staff, framed as a patient safety concern. The third call went back to Valley Ridge Nursing College, his voice hard now. I need you to verify every credential Sarah Chen submitted. Everyone. And I need it by 9 a.m. At 0900 hours, Sarah was summoned to Human Resources on the 4th floor. The termination letter was already printed. She could see it from the doorway, 2 pages of letterhead, a seal from the hospital administration, her name typed in official font. The HR director, a woman named Paulson who'd always maintained careful neutrality, gestured for Sarah to sit. She didn't sit. Paulson's voice was mechanical, the script of someone who delivered this news before, practicing beyond your scope of licensure. Unauthorized treatment protocols. Insubordination. The ICU resident states you overrode his clinical judgment and ordered medications without consulting the attending. You compromised patient safety. The patient's lab stabilized. The words came out level, exact. No emotion. No defense. Just fact. That's not the point. You're not qualified to make those decisions. You don't have the credentials for. I saved her life. Sarah's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Her hands remained perfectly steady. Her potassium was climbing toward cardiac dysrhythmia. Her kidney function was collapsing. The chelation protocol was the only intervention that would have prevented. And that's exactly the problem. Paulson slid the termination letter across the desk. You're terminated effective immediately. You need to turn in your badge and scrubs by end of shift. Dr. Whitfield will be documenting this incident with the state nursing board as well. The word sat in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Sarah looked at the letter. She could have fought it. She could have called her command, could have triggered classified protocols, could have brought the full weight of Naval Special Warfare Group 1 down on St. Michael's with a single phone call. Instead, she nodded once. I understand. She turned and walked out. By 1600 hours, the hospital laundry room was empty except for Sarah. The industrial dryer hummed its white noise song, the fluorescents casting everything in the color of exhaustion. She folded her scrubs for the last time, each piece precisely, the way they'd taught her at Great Lakes, the kind of discipline that turned bodies into tools. The fabric was still warm from the cycle, carrying the ghost of disinfectant and her own sweat from the night shift. Top fold. Bottom fold. Smooth the corners. Stacked them perfectly. Her badge lay on the folding table beside her, the ID photo showing a tired woman with no particular threat in her eyes. Just a nurse. Just someone who changed bedpans and refilled 4 bags. She picked up the badge and held it for a moment, the laminate cool against her palm. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. 12 years of service. 3 deployments. 2 Bronze Stars. That person didn't exist in this hospital anymore. Outside the laundry room window, autumn rain began falling against Portland. It drummed against the glass with the sound of 1,000 small fists demanding entry. Sarah set her badge and folded scrubs on the return cart and moved toward the door. Her limp was back, the weight of the day settling into her hip the way exhaustion did when you stopped fighting it. Somewhere 3 floors up, Emma Carstairs was alive because Sarah Chen had forgotten to stay invisible. Her mission was compromised. Her cover was shattered. Her classified placement at St. Michael's was finished, and she had no extraction protocol, no next assignment waiting, no authority to stand on. She was just a former nurse with a termination letter and a rain-soaked parking lot ahead of her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd do it again. Exactly the same way. For the same child. For any child. That was the thing about people like her. Once you'd learned what it meant to save a life, you couldn't unknow it. You couldn't pretend it didn't matter. You couldn't go back to being invisible just because the job demanded it. She reached for the laundry room door. And that's when the sound reached the administrative wing, the deep, distinctive rumble of heavy vehicles, the particular rhythm of a military convoy that made every veteran in a 2-block radius stand straighter without thinking. The convoy arrived at 1,400 hours sharp. 2 black SUVs pulled through the St. Michael's main entrance with the kind of precision that made administrative staff pause mid-sentence. The vehicles didn't creep or hesitate. They came in formation, black paint gleaming, government plates catching afternoon light like a warning. A third vehicle followed, unmarked sedan, tinted windows, the particular aesthetic of federal authority. The guard at the front desk stood without being asked. 12 years of Navy service before the prosthetic knee meant muscle memory didn't care about rank or years elapsed. His hand moved to the security radio. His voice came out steady, "We have military arrival." Inside the administrative wing, Dr. Whitfield was in his 3rd consecutive meeting with hospital legal counsel. The DoD audit had expanded faster than containment protocols could handle. 36 months of billing records, pharmaceutical procurement, patient stays extended specifically to justify medication regimens that had no clinical justification. The paper trail was immaculate because Whitfield never imagined visibility. The board president had resigned at dawn. The chief of staff was under investigation. His attorney kept using the word plea deal, and Whitfield kept hearing the word prison underneath it. When the Marine Corps colonel walked through the administrative wing entrance, people moved like they'd practiced it. The uniform was dress blues, the insignia matched the voice that came next, not loud, but shaped to carry through rooms and settle into bones. "I'm looking for Nightingale 6. Official DoD business. Now." The elderly security guard at the front desk, Martinez, name tape still visible on the faded windbreaker, went pale. Not gradual pale. The kind of white that happens when the brain recognizes something the conscious mind hasn't processed yet. His hand moved to his desk calendar, then to the personnel roster. His eyes found the entry. His voice came out different. Not timid. Different. The voice of a man who'd just realized what he was looking at. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Chen," Martinez said. His voice carried through the administrative wing like a submarine sonar pulse. Doctors in nearby offices froze. Nurses checking schedules stopped moving. The words continued, each one landing like a deck stamp on official documentation. "She's got 2 Bronze Stars. Purple Heart from Marja. That's Master Chief." The silence that followed wasn't empty. Silence packed that tight usually means something fundamental just shifted in how a room understands itself. Admiral James Carstairs stepped forward before anyone could decide what to do with the information. He wore the dress whites, the uniform sharp enough to cut, and his daughter Emma held his hand between his forefinger and thumb, the way children do when they're trying not to break something precious. Emma's hair was growing back. Not all the way yet, but thick at the roots, dark and healthy, the way it should have been 6 months ago when the first thinning patches appeared. The kind of recovery that only happens when someone knows exactly what to fix and has the competence to fix it. Whitfield stepped into the hallway because his attorney had told him to cooperate. The Admiral's gaze met his, and what moved across the doctor's face in that moment was recognition. Not of who Sarah Chen was. Of what he'd done, standing in front of the man whose daughter he'd spent 3 years slowly poisoning for profit, whose extended hospital stay he'd fought to maintain, whose chelation therapy he'd specifically discouraged because it would cure her too quickly and end the billable hours. "You called an investigation into her credentials," the Admiral said. His voice was quiet. The quiet that comes before very large things happen. Standard DoD protocol. Automatic security audit when military cover gets probed at a civilian institution. The auditors came with a warrant. They found everything. The pharmaceutical kickback scheme unraveled in 48 hours. Bank records showed quarterly deposits from Apex Pharmaceutical Solutions, $847,000 across 36 months in payments disguised as consulting fees that nobody could prove existed. Email communications with representatives specified patient protocols designed to extend stays. Patient charts showed medication regimens that had no clinical justification, extended hospitalizations that delayed discharge, treatment plans shaped around what would generate bills instead of what would generate healing. The weapon Whitfield had used against Sarah, the credential investigation, the board pressure, the institutional leverage, had detonated in his own hands. He'd taught the investigators exactly where to look. The board meeting happened on day 3. Whitfield sat alone at the conference table while lawyers read findings in the kind of meticulous language that transforms a person into a historical event. His medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. Hospital privileges terminated. The board president resigned under pressure. The chief of staff took sudden medical leave and never came back. By week's end, the local news ran the story: prominent Portland physician under investigation for fraud exceeding $2 million. The vacation home in Aspen went on the market. The Tesla was repossessed. His wife filed for divorce on day 12, and the marriage dissolution paperwork specifically mentioned fraud, which meant every social circle would understand why she left before she did. 6 months later, Sarah returned to St. Michael's in her Navy service khakis. The uniform fit like it had been waiting in a locker exactly for this purpose. Her hair was regulation length. Her posture carried the weight of the rank the way bone carries weight, not as addition but as basic structure. Admiral Carstairs met her in the lobby with Emma, and the girl hugged Sarah's waist hard enough that the uniform creased. They walked together through hallways where staff now nodded respectfully, where the legend had already migrated from whispered story into established fact. The nurse who'd been invisible had become the person everyone suddenly remembered seeing everywhere. Through the front windows of the main corridor, Sarah saw the strip mall across the street. The tax service, the nail salon, and between them, Dr. Whitfield at a folding table. Not the high-end kind of table. The kind you'd find at a church donation drive or a community college booth. A stack of laminated brochures featuring supplemental insurance options that no one had asked for. He wore a suit that had never cost what his previous suits had cost. His shoulders carried a hunch that suggested he'd started folding inward. The expensive watch was gone. The wedding ring was gone. The posture was the posture of a man who discovered that the network he'd spent 3 decades building would collapse like wet cardboard the moment institutional pressure landed on him. Sarah paused at the glass. Admiral Carstairs followed her gaze without needing guidance. He called in every favor he had, the Admiral said quietly. His voice carried the kind of respect that comes from understanding exactly what someone had sacrificed. Used his entire network to destroy you. And that network destroyed him instead. The irony was so complete, so geometrically perfect, that even stating it felt insufficient. The weapon had turned. The architect had been caught in his own design. Emma tugged Sarah's hand, and they continued to the pediatric wing where Dr. Morrison waited with Emma's chart. Every marker normal. Every system healthy. The hair growth trajectory was tracking beautifully. The metal toxicity that had been destroying the child's system was completely eliminated. Sergeant David Torres was there too, recovering now, walking with a cane because the injury sustained 5 years ago in Marja required accommodation that physical therapy had worked down to functional limitation. When he saw Sarah, recognition moved across his face like a wave breaking. His hand came up in a salute, not casual, not automatic, but the kind of salute that carries years of weight in its geometry. His eyes were wet. "Marja," he said simply. "I remember." Sarah returned the salute, her composure perfect, her hand moving with the precision that had earned her 3 Navy Commendation Medals and the respect of everyone who'd ever served under her command. As they prepared to leave the pediatric wing, Emma returned the polished challenge coin to Sarah. The Admiral had it cleaned and restored, the metal gleaming under hospital fluorescent lights, no longer tarnished by the toxic residue that had nearly killed his daughter. Sarah held it for a moment, the weight familiar in her palm, then gave it back to Emma. "It brought you home," she said. "Keep it." Walking to her car, Sarah passed the strip mall one more time. The folding table was still there. Dr. Whitfield looked up briefly as she walked past the window, recognition flickering across his face, not recognition of who Sarah Chen actually was, but the sudden understanding of what her presence meant. What it had cost him. What it had saved. He looked down at his brochures. Sarah didn't slow down. She kept walking the way apex predators walk, smooth and complete, like the moment had been solved the instant she entered it. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Sarah had given Emma Carstairs a future when 15 credentialed doctors had sent her home to die. That was the mission. That was exactly how it should have ended. Not with recognition or medals or the kind of visible authority that needed validation. Just with the quiet understanding that she'd chosen a 9-year-old girl's life over her own cover identity, and the universe had arranged itself around that choice in ways that required no explanation. Subscribe to see more stories like this one. Like this video. And tell us in the comments, would you have walked away, or would you have saved her too?